I'm going to call the Fiscal Committee together for this meeting on Monday, April 2nd. I need, first of all, approval of the minutes for Monday, March 5th, 2012. May I have a motion, please?
So moved, Aguilar.
Second, Karski.
Moved by Aguilar, seconded by Karski. Any corrections, changes, comments? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign. Those are approved. Item number 3, reports and updates. We have 2 discussion items today on our agenda. The first is a discussion of how to spend remaining CIP budget funds. We'll start the discussion with Dave Bixler and Rich Oaksel, council staff. Rich, from the lead internal auditor.
Good afternoon, committee. Rich Oaksel with Internal Audit. Last month you tasked David Bixler and myself with investigating what other municipalities are doing with regard to budget surpluses, especially with capital funds. David and I, we researched this independently, and then we met, and what we found is that there's limited resources to tap regarding the subject. We just couldn't find any particular policies that local governments have adopted for dealing with budget surplus. What we did find is that there's a lot of different opinions out there to what to do with a budget surplus, whether you can pay down the debt, build your reserves, or address other pressing needs. There's no common thread policy or approach. Our research identified 2 reasons for that. First, the capital surplus is not a common situation, or at least it's not something that you anticipate happening. And secondly, the economic climate, the financial strength of the local government, and capital needs can all play a role in determining what is the best use of the funds. So our recommendations that Dave and I came up with would involve having finance provide a pro forma report estimating or forecasting any potential surplus or deficit, and then having the fiscal committee or the council letting them know which month that information would be provided. Obviously, earlier in the year doesn't seem to make much sense. There's too many variables that would not be very practical. As far as in the past 10 years or so, we've had, I think, 1 year when we have not had a surplus. I believe it was 2009 or thereabouts when there was holdbacks. Otherwise, typically we've had a surplus, and it's usually in the $2 to $4 million range. So the second step of what we propose is that if we know that or anticipate a surplus, if there's a high probability of a surplus, we would have the mayor enlisting the directors to come up with a list of projects that could or should be considered for funding. The director who champions the project could either provide a synopsis of the project to the council, highlighting the needs and the benefits, or they could present the project to the council in a working session. That would allow some give and take between the director and the council members to clear up any misunderstandings, or at least give the council enough information so that they can make a well-informed decision about which projects should be considered for funding. And then Dave and I came up with maybe a way of determining which projects should rise to the top of the list for the council to consider. We suggest having a list of criteria that the council could use to rate the projects in a standardized format, and having a criteria scale that would be weighted and standardized so that all the projects could be measured similarly. Each council would rate the projects. We could make a very simple scale, a 1 to 4 scale for the various criteria, and then all the council scores could be consolidated and tallied, and resulting in each project having an overall weighted score. And David, if you're interested, David can provide a little detail on that, how that would look. So, David.
Come on up, Dave.
Dave Bixler, budget analyst. What we would recommend, or what we're suggesting, is that we would look at 4 or 5 criteria, maybe from the priorities of the council or what benefits to the community we want to establish and use as a guiding tool for this project. So we would like to have each of those weighted, and then, or each of those weightings for each of those criteria, and then each of the council could then go through and weight each of those projects with that scale of 1 to 4, meaning something like if it benefits most citizens, or if it's safety, it might have a heavier weighting, those types of things. But that would be established, I would think, at a working session that we would use to go forward. But that way, everybody votes anonymously somewhat, and then the numbers weigh it out.
Questions for David or Rich from the committee? Councilor Jameson.
I would add the criteria factor is what I believe is used, at least in the street department, determining which roads should be addressed. They have a criteria, quite some spreadsheet that they go through addressing each of the fundamental issues of safety, land availability, traffic counts, other things. So there's merit to the some type of a criteria scale like that. One of the other, I suppose, elements would be whether or not any CIP items have been pushed off or out of the current cycle, so that, like for instance, in this case, we would want to make sure that none of the projects in 11 were abandoned or eliminated for some reason, and we didn't know about it. So we'd want to check that as part of the process as well. But as far as voting anonymously, I'm not sure about that. But at the end of the day, we're after a process here, so we don't reinvent the wheel every year when we get to this time. And I think we're on our way. Anyway.
Other questions? If not, if the Finance Department would like to weigh in, we'd be interested in hearing if you so desire. Director Turback.
Thank you. Is there anything in particular you'd like me to address relative to this, or just a general comment?
I think more from a policy standpoint, your meetings with council staff and thoughts on whether you think that's a workable solution.
Okay. I think as the council would in any situation, you certainly want to approach any policy setting process with deliberation and caution, I guess, and this certainly would be no different. And I think Councilor Rolfing mentioned last month at your meeting that you certainly don't want to box in future councils into something that essentially guides them down a path they don't want to be on. I think you want to provide enough guidance in your policy to at least provide some direction as to what types of things or uses ought to be considered without tying the hands of the council. And I think from a policy standpoint, that would be my thought on it. I think the tool of using some sort of a rating or scoring system can certainly be an effective tool for any decision-making process. If I was in your shoes, I guess I'm not sure how I would feel about that in terms of determining how to make use of a surplus. You don't use that process for the overall CIP, which is many, many more dollars than what you're talking about typically than you would have in a surplus. So that's really your decision as to how much time and effort you want to put into determining how to spend what might be 1 or 2% of your overall capital plan. You may end up spending more time on that than you do on the entire plan itself. So just some general thoughts, I guess. I'd certainly try to answer any questions you might have.
Karski.
I guess no question here, but it's a great situation to be in, to have extra money that we can to take a look at and how we want to improve our city. A couple things come to mind, and I know they've been discussed, is paying down bonds. Our older, higher interest bonds comes to mind. Capital programs, if we're going to look at capital programs, we should be looking at stuff that's non-personnel impact. I mean, if we're going to build a fire station, we better have into our budget personnel to man that fire station. That takes a little bit more time. So I see funds like this being available for projects like roads, building improvements like we did with City Hall to improve the conditions for the employees that work in there, et cetera. And I would prefer also to keep it as each council, or as each year goes by, for that council to address the needs that may be most pressing at that point. So, my input.
The city already has a very thorough, very deliberative process, I think, in establishing a long-term capital improvement plan. We go through that every year, and it's not unlike the process that has kind of been outlined, that those projects typically start in the departments with an idea or an identified need. They're prioritized within the individual departments. Those recommendations or ideas are brought forward in some sort of priority order to finance and to the mayor's office. And those are, again, kind of melded together into a recommended plan that comes to the council where further deliberation and changes can be made. So I think we've got a pretty well-established process in terms of identifying and evaluating and prioritizing how capital dollars are used. It's how you apply that similar or a similar process to surplus funds is really, you know, I don't know why you would do anything a whole lot different than you would do for your overall plan. Certainly, you're not compelled to do anything. I mean, you could certainly wait and let those dollars roll over into the next year's plan, and projects would be prioritized just as they are each and every year, and those dollars would simply be additional dollars available to fund the next plan. That's not an uncommon approach from what I've seen from other communities. It just depends on, to some extent, how quickly you feel the need to get those dollars out there and put them to use, how compelling the individual projects might be.
Councilor Jameson.
I know we're working on the policy and trying to develop that, but Tracy, you had a recommendation back in your March 27th email to use that for paying down or eliminating the need to do some of the bonding on the event center. Could you explain your recommendation to us?
Well, that is the recommendation that, as you folks are aware, the bonds that have been sold to this point fund most but not all of the event center project. There will be a need to provide some additional funding for that project to fulfill the entire $115 million budget. The expectation is at this point that additional money will come almost entirely from selling additional bonds. And so it seems like this is a good opportunity to mitigate that by utilizing cash that's available that could be applied to the event center project, reduce the amount of debt necessary to fund the project without disrupting any other projects that are currently in the plan. You know, the plan that's being executed today for 2012 was approved only 6 months ago, roughly, and that project or that plan is moving forward and being executed, and those projects are being put into place. So this is an opportunity, I think, to address what is certainly one of the key priority capital projects in the community, and at the same time save significant dollars on borrowing costs, provide some additional flexibility over the years to come in our capital plan because our debt service costs would be lower in that respect. So I think there are a lot of reasons to that made this particular recommendation come to the top very, very quickly from my perspective.
When you, I suppose, and the administration made this recommendation, did you get a draft from all the other directors on what they thought should be done with that $4 million, as far as other CIP projects that they would address?
We took kind of an abbreviated but comprehensive approach, very similar to what we do each year for the capital plan. We asked all the departments for input on how those dollars might best be used. That input came to finance. Finance reviewed it, discussed it with the mayor, and the result was the recommendation that you've seen. So we've looked at the existing plan and opportunities for projects that might be moved up in time. Some departments had ideas or gave input on projects that aren't in the current plan, things that might be done. The idea of just letting the money, setting it aside and reprogramming it and allowing the normal annual capital updating process to work its course was another alternative that was weighed. So there were really kind of four general alternatives that we looked at.
I would just need to add that, this timetable moved pretty fast. Everything happened pretty fast from the time that it was identified and, in essence, your recommendation. But would it be a problem for the council to see those recommendations from those directors?
Well, you have, like I say, most of those projects, I believe most of them are in the plan now. So I mean, you have that information now. You certainly have that. One of the projects that was recommended or suggested as an alternative that we're hoping and planning to follow through on, that's not in the current plan, has to do with the library and implementing some new technology that will really gain some significant efficiency. So we're looking for other ways, and I think we found other ways to fund that particular project. But ultimately, this process has worked just the same as it did last year, just the same as the annual capital improvement planning process works. And I mean, you have our recommendation. It's certainly only a recommendation. It's up to you folks as a full council to make a determination. So whether or not you agree that that's the most prudent, responsible use for those dollars.
All right, well, then I think I get the answer that no, you are not going to forward those recommendations from those directors to the council. That's what I asked.
We didn't.
And I asked this last year, and it took forever. And this is what bothers me about this whole process, and this is why I was trying to avoid it, is because I had to put some directors under tremendous pressure to give me that list before it got filtered through the administration. And here we are now. We want to know, I want to know what the Parks Department thinks we should do for our city, what the Public Works Department thinks we should do for our city, the Library Department, on and on. And if you're going to filter that for us, well then, I guess we'll have to ask and make our own decisions. This is your recommendation, and that's it? Fine.
That's no different than the process that happens every year with updating the capital improvement plan. Departments almost always will submit more projects than what show up in the recommended plan to you folks. We don't flood you with all sorts of projects that have been weeded out along the way. I don't understand why we would treat this process for $4 million any differently than we do the $400 million plan that we update every year. Last year we came to you with a pretty nice, neat little package of projects that totaled up to the amount of funding that was available. We don't have that this year. We didn't identify a list of projects that total up to $4 million. Well, we've got one, and that's the recommendation. That's the one project we're recommending is to utilize those dollars to lower the amount of debt for the event center project.
Tracy, a couple of questions. Remind me, first of all, the tax-exempt portion of the bonding that we did for the event center. What's the total package on that? How much is it?
It's 102 out of the 115 million.
So we have 13 million more that we'll have to do in the taxable bonds.
Very likely, most of that the remaining 13 million would be taxable bonds. Yep.
What, as we sit here today, and I know I'm asking you to look into the crystal ball, but we did this before, what interest rate would you expect on those taxable bonds?
Well, just based on the rate that we received last month on our tax-exempt issue and adding the kind of what we've been told is a typical premium on taxable bonds versus tax-exempt bonds, I would estimate we'd be somewhere around 5%. If I can maybe extrapolate that and try to anticipate your next question, if we amortize $4 million out over the 22-year term of the bonds, that would translate to about somewhere in the range of $2.5 to $3 million of interest costs. Or another way to look at it would be over the 22 years, on average each year there would be an additional $300,000 available for the capital plan.
We have many other bonds out there. Would it make sense to take some of those higher interest bonds and pay those off before doing these very low interest rate bonds?
That's something we could certainly take a look at. The thing we run into is that the higher rate bond, I don't know if they would be higher than what taxable bonds would be today necessarily, but they may or may not be callable. Typically, the practice of the city has been to evaluate those as they're approaching their call date so that we can evaluate whether or not there are savings to be obtained. And just like we did, the city did a year or two ago with the entertainment tax bonds. Those were refinanced or called. You can't do that. It's not like paying off your mortgage early where you can do that on any payment date. Most of the bonds that the city issues, maybe all of them, would have a call date 10 years in. So anything issued in the last 10 years would not be available to be prepaid, very likely.
Could we check just to make sure if we have any interest rates out there that are in the 6% range
Sure.
or higher that I would think fiscally it'd make more sense to pay those off early?
Yeah, absolutely. Can certainly look at that.
Councilor Karski.
I guess I'd like to clarify two things if I could, Tracy. Just to emphasize that if we did pay or use this money to reduce the bond, it would not increase the amount of money being paid for an event center, our $115 million.
The budget of 115 would not change.
Okay.
That's right.
And then second of all, do bonds work like a home mortgage, for example, where the greatest percentage of the first initial payments are interest, and as you get into the paying the bond back, where more of that's principal and you wouldn't be saving as much in interest, the best time to pay off a note is earlier in the process rather than later?
Yeah, that's true. The payments in general, we've tried to keep fairly level, which means you're paying more interest early and less principal, and as you go, you pay less interest and more principal.
Okay, so those older bonds may not, we'd just be gaining on the principal payment, not on any interest payment.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions from the committee? What are the wishes of the committee in terms of what council staff has recommended? Do we want to vet that further before our next monthly meeting? Councilor Jamieson.
Well, it's troublesome that we would have to wait, I guess, continue to wait, because I think the purpose of collecting that money is to leverage it for the citizens as fast as we can at the highest priority need. We do have to fix this. We just got to fix it. So maybe in the best interest, we just need to slowly go through the process of figuring out, making sure that our priorities of the council are met, the needs of the city are met, and work through those criteria and just set them and work it through the rest of the councilors and I'll bite my tongue on the rest.
Any other comments? Councilor Aguilar.
I agree with Councilor Jamieson. I think that there's more work that needs to be done, and I think that we have a good starting point by what Rich and Dave put together for us, but I wouldn't want to rush into it without taking more of a look at the process that's being suggested.
Councilor Karski.
I have no problem with taking our time. The only question I have would be is, are we under a timeline for the bond issuance for the taxable bonds? When would we expect to be doing that issuance?
We don't have any plans imminent to issue bonds. My expectation is that would occur following completion of the naming rights process for the facility. There's as part of that process, there may be the opportunity to get some cash infusion that could go toward construction as well, which would, similar to this $4 million, would reduce the amount of debt necessary for the project. If that happens, then that certainly drives the size of the bond issue, and it would be important to have a decision on the $4 million before doing that as well. So I mean, there's interplay there among this particular issue and the naming rights, and ultimately the financing the rest of the project.
Thank you.
Councilor Aguilar.
Tracy, in the initial email you sent us with your suggestion, you did say that you were going to have an ordinance prepared stating such. Has that been scheduled?
Yes, I believe it was delivered to the clerk's office this morning, so that it would be on first reading next week, with second reading on whatever that would be, the 16th. And that ordinance would simply allow the money to be transferred from the second penny fund to the capital projects fund where the event center costs are being paid.
Thank you.
I think that we'll have to let that stand on its merits itself and work through this policy, because this has been an annual issue And so I would like to appoint Counselor Jamison and Counselor Karski to work with City Council staff on setting up the more definite areas of the criteria, if that's agreeable to the committee. Very well, that's what we will do. Next agenda item, discussion on the pension design study. Bill, I apologize, we're going to have about 10 minutes for this, and then we're going to have to adjourn so the clerks can get ready for the 7 o'clock meeting. But we left the informational meeting, and one of the requests was that this committee deal with the wage study you had done before, I believe, and how that compared to the private sector.
Bill O'Toole from Human Resources. If I could, just a quick kind of recap where we are. Maybe some folks in the audience haven't been up to speed, maybe some folks watching at home. Obviously, the Pension Board of Trustees has done a lot of work reviewing the pension plan, and they were tasked with identifying system alternatives and plan design changes necessary to reduce and stabilize the city's annual pension contribution rates. And they put together a nice menu of changes. And obviously, there are three important groups in the city of Sioux Falls that would be affected by any of those changes. It's our existing retirees, our current employees, and future employees. So it was kind of the three buckets that we looked at. And as this body knows, there was no recommendation to deal with existing retirees. There were recommendations that dealt with current employees and future employees. And I really have to give credit to the Pension Board of Trustees, the time that they took in working with Kavanaugh McDonald and getting to the recommendations that are before you today. I know when the informational briefing was had and Kavanaugh McDonald was here to give that presentation, there was a request to talk about the comparison of public-private sector. I think, Councilor Brown, it was you. I do have some information from that study that dealt with the pension benefits itself, but all that information you're going to see was comparison to other public sector jurisdictions. I'd be happy to make that information available. There was not any private sector comparison as it related to specifically pension plan. There was some level of private sector data as it related to wage information, but that obviously wasn't a component of the pension plan, but I'd be happy to provide that information. And I guess ultimately to talk about the mission, if you will, once the pension board provided the recommendations to the elected officials, hopefully we're going to get to the point then where we can identify collectively what are those recommendations that we do wish to follow and do wish to try to implement for those respective groups. And I'm certainly welcome to answer any questions that you might have. We'll get you that information. I have some of it with me here today. Obviously, you're going to need some time to review it, but any other questions in this brief amount of time that we have left?
I do have, well, let me ask the committee first if you have any questions. I do have one. That was the full report we received, or an executive summary of it. Will there be a recommendation from the mayor on what the next steps will be in terms of what he's advocating for and changes?
At some point, yes. I mean, obviously, I can't speak for him, but that was one of the ideas, is to get that information from the mayor. He's still looking at some of the information as well, but at some point, that'll be part of this process as well. I guess I'll leave it at that.
This week?
Again, I don't have a definitive date from him, Counselor.
Okay. Because we have basically a month, we were told, to deal with this?
There's some, we were hoping to have not much more than a month, just because depending on what it is we're going to be doing, we're going to need some time to implement employee training sessions and implementation of ordinances. There's quite a bit of work to be done with that, but at the same token, you need your time as well. We can adapt if council needs a little bit of time.
Okay. Other questions? Councilor Jamison.
Bill, can you categorize, I mean, I think everybody's perceived the city's benefit package as, federal government does it better, then it's the city, and then it's the state, and probably the county. Do you see it in that same order, as far as governmental bodies and their pension and retirement plans, benefits?
Yeah, there's a matter of perception there, but I mean, if you're just talking the pension system, I mean, obviously I think the federal government, the state government, city government all have defined benefit plans. that vary, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you I'm an expert on the federal benefit system. I'm not, but our system and what we offer is very competitive, and I think even the changes that have been identified from the pension board are still very reasonable, very fair, and at the end of the day, even with some cost shifting and benefit reductions, we still have, I think, a very palatable plan that will allow us to continue to attract and retain employees.
Councilor Karski.
Just so I understand the process, the unions, basically, the employee union groups have to approve this before it comes to the council, is that correct?
Not the union groups. Any change affecting any current member requires a vote of the membership, which shouldn't be confused with the union membership. The
Okay.
membership is everybody that's a current member of the pension system.
Thanks for clarifying.
And anybody that's the future, that actually becomes a policy decision for the city of Sioux Falls. That does not require a vote of the membership. That can be the wishes of the elected officials.
So this does require going to the membership or does not before it comes to the
Any
council?
of the recommendations that would affect a current member, those would be required to go to the membership for a vote.
Okay.
So the objective here is to first get a sense from the elected officials, what are those benefits affecting current members you would like to see pursued to go to that vote. And then after that process, that would then lead to additional ordinance changes, those kinds of things, if it was approved.
Okay.
I hope that made sense, Counselor.
Bill, when is the next wage study scheduled? I don't remember how often we do those.
We do those every 8 to 10 years, and the last one was in 2009.
Is going forward, obviously we can't change what we've already done, but going forward, does it make sense to do wage, not only wage, but benefit comparisons to the private sector to see if we're in line with what's going on in the local marketplace?
You know, that's a difficult question to answer. It depends what your objectives are. I mean, what are you trying to accomplish? What do you want to do? You know, like I said, the past study that we've done, I'm trying to think back to 2000 when we did the one before. You know, I actually think this one was a pretty good study when we hired the Siegel company to come in. You know, it's never a bad idea to obviously collect more information, but in relation to what the pension board was tasked with in terms of its analysis, you know, that's a whole different discussion, a whole different set of analysis as opposed to what was done here and what was being recommended.
You know, we strive to make sure that we keep up on the wages, and I think the benefits of the city certainly are an attraction to employees too, and I think that we need to understand how it compares, and I know it's not apples to apples, obviously, with a defined plan, but I would encourage you to think about that in the next study, and whether that's even possible, I don't know, but
Again, it becomes very difficult when you're looking to making sure you are doing an apples-to-apples comparison. It's not impossible, but there are cautions that would have to be made to make sure you're making those appropriate comparisons in terms of the educational requirements, those kinds of things. But certainly within the scope of writing an RFP for a comp and benefit study, that could be written into that analysis.
other questions? Councilor Jameson.
Bill, is there any type of a graph, though, that you could set up with the feds, the state, the county, and ourselves? Because, you know, I remember the wage study we did back in '09, I guess it was, but our barometer that I thought we were using was just whether or not people still applied for a job at the city if we offered one at a wage, so that we could retain good employees and hire good employees and not lose them out to the private sector and be competitive in our city with that process. Is there any way of developing, though, a graph, though, that would just say, you know, your insurance costs or how they're shared federally and in the state and on the county level, and just some basic things so we could have something to...
We could try to collect that information, because I think there may be some of that available publicly, but it's
Right.
one of those, you know, for which positions, which occupations, do you just want general numbers as it relates? I mean,
You help me.
you got to start slicing and dicing it, you know, equally in order to do that. But if you're just looking at broad-based,
Broad-based, I think anything, just give us some framework, because I think we're sitting out here in the dark here. You know, my benefit package at my company, you know, it's pretty starkly different. so I need help understanding what other programs are like. It's not what I do, and I think it would be beneficial for all the counselors to see something, just to grasp our brain around it, because otherwise you're asking us to shoot from the hip, make judgment calls based on how we feel when our perspective is all different.
Well, and I think it's fair to say that in the private sector, the benefits packages aren't getting bigger.
Right.
And they're not even staying the same.
Well, and if you look at the level of recommendations in terms of the benefit reductions, if you will, that's exactly what the pension board has done. And I guess, counselors, we're not asking you to shoot from the hip or shoot from the dark. I guess part of this process was that there be at least some level of confidence that the pension board did their due diligence satisfactorily at their level, along with the administration, in looking at this, so that what's in front of you isn't just, we're asking you to shoot from the hip, that they've done a good look. Now, we certainly want you to have the information you feel comfortable at this level. And if there's something we can provide, we're certainly willing to do it.
I'm going to have to end the discussion there. We are already over, and I don't want to hurt our clerk's time to prepare. So, any other open discussion?
Well, I guess my question is, where do we go from here? Because of your time limitations, where would you want us to go next?
Well, ultimately, what we want you to do is identify which of those recommendations you'd like to pursue, or if there's any additional ones that you'd like to pursue or have more discussion about it. Again, just this is obviously for your body, but maybe one of the things you could decide is, what process do you want to follow to get you that end result? I mean, do you want more input from administration? Do you want any input from anyone else for this process? Maybe identifying process would be helpful as well. Just a suggestion.
We've gone from one issue where the council wasn't asked for input to one where now we're asked for the input. I would recommend that the information needs to come from the mayor on what he wants to propose. And we need to see that as soon as possible.
I would just respond to that, Councilor. That's eventually going to come. Obviously, when we scoped this project and we talked about it from day one, that at the end of the day, this was part of that process, is that once the pension board finished, they would provide those recommendations to the elected officials.
Well, let's have this discussion on the fiscal committee for next month. We'll have to see how it shapes before then to get more specific for that agenda. Any other recommendations?
No, any other information that can be provided by the administration, though, would be appreciated at this point. What the mayor's thoughts are, plays into this. But also, if there's anything that you feel would help us take a further look at the suggested items, that would also be appreciated.
We will have some information for you.
Thank you.
All right, we are adjourned.